Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're discussing what to do about reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. A weekend donors conference pledged $5.4 billion in Cairo. Is it Band-Aid diplomacy? We're talking about it with Majid Messaouden, member of France's Front de Gauche, who chairs the Observers in Palestine Committee. Gil Mihaly, columnist at Yediot Aharonot and editor-in-chief of Causeur. Tell the folks what Causeur is.
It's a French political monthly.
French political monthly. Joining us from Brussels, she's a Sinn Féin member of the European Parliament, Martina Anderson. And congratulations, you told us in part one of the discussion, you're now the chair of the Palestinian Legislative Council for the relations with the Palestinian Legislative Council within the European Parliament. And in London, Hugh Lovett of the European Council on Foreign Relations. We're talking about how before the break over who should pay the tab. Majid Messaouden making the point that it should be Israel. Gil Mihaly making the point that when of the situation when the war began. Point is that when the dust has settled, once again, Israel has won in terms of its military objectives, but perhaps, Gil, is it fair to say lost the public relations battle?
Yes, it's fair to say. It's fair to say. And what's even more important is that I think it's clear that a page should be turned, and that 9 years after the withdrawal from Gaza, Israel should think again of its strategy. Because I think that what's happened in the last 9 years was, to say the least, not very efficient, and with the enormous changes in the Middle East, there are new opportunities, and I think a new strategy is really necessary.
Now, Gil, you think that, but what's public opinion like in Israel on that score?
Well, Israeli public opinion. If you present a reasonable a solution with a trustworthy partner, like it was the case in 77-81 with Egypt, and later with Yasser Arafat or with the late King Hussein, Israeli public opinion will probably accept.
All right, but this brings us back to the point that we were talking about in part one of our discussion, which is who to come up with the plan and who to broker it. Both Martina Anderson and Hugh Lovett saying that it's regretful that so far it hasn't been Europe. Now, the Palestinian president in Cairo over the weekend sitting down with the U.S. Secretary of State, but once again, like he did last month at the UN, Mahmoud Abbas strongly hinting that the time for U.S. mediation has passed, and it's time to take his case directly to the United Nations.
The international community is being asked more than ever before to support our struggle, to issue a decree from the UN Security Council in order to place an ultimatum to end the occupation, and from there to move to serious negotiations in order to answer all the issues for a permanent solution.
So realistically, Hugh Lovett, realistically, who's the best broker right now for the talks? Is it still the United States? Is it the UN? Is it the European Union?
About peace talks. I mean, we have to recognize at the moment that it has been the exclusive preserve of the US, and that the EU has been doing not much more than cheerleading US efforts. That doesn't mean it should continue that way, but I think, realistically, this is the way that it's been framed. But I think likewise, and it's no secret that obviously Palestinians don't feel they have much of an honest broker in the US government, even under President Obama, who many would assume to be very or more sympathetic towards the Palestinian cause. You haven't seen much of a shift in US policy, and certainly not much of a shift even from the Bush era. And I think and it's very illustrative if you look at the 9 months of peace negotiations that Kerry was conducting that ultimately failed. In actual fact, the US negotiating position moved a lot closer to the Israeli position than to the Palestinians, and even closer to the Israeli position than it was previously under Bush. So I think, so this is an ultimate issue. Likewise, the problem is the EU, there is no such thing as an EU policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You basically have 28 foreign policies. And if you try to get a consensus, it's a consensus based on the lowest common denominator, which is decidedly very low. So I think if we're still within this general framework of peace negotiations as the US preserve, the best that the EU can do is, as I mentioned earlier, if the EU has the appetite, then it is to try to do some what we call like front running for the US, to actually try to prepare the ground a bit more for future negotiations. This would be some initiatives that have been discussed recently by the EU, and some of them implemented, which would aim to distinguish further between what is legitimate Israel and then what is the settlements. So applying EU law, rules and regulations to its bilateral relations with Israel, which don't include the settlements. But I think
let me bring in Martina. Let me bring in Martina
framework.
Anderson on this. Martina, is it mission impossible, A, to have a common European policy when it comes to Mideast peace talks, and B, to get the EU to be accepted as a broker?
Well, I don't think we should regard it as mission impossible. We have, as I said, made the impossible possible. So if you have the political will, and if you have all of the players willing to make a contribution, we can certainly move it forward. I think
in Northern Ireland, you had one broker, not 28.
That said, we still had an awful lot of difficulties to try to address. And we've got a system of government at the moment in the north of Ireland that it wouldn't be where you start off. You have a consociational model of government where you have 5 parties around the table. And we had to devise this system of government because never again could we allow one community to police another, one community to policy another, and the kind of discrimination that we had experienced growing up. I had never any relationships with the state at all, and here I am now as Sinn Féin MEP.
All right, so the impossible is possible, but when it comes to Europe, how do you get Europe to be the broker? Concretely, how do you do it?
Well, I think Europe has to honour its own commitments. We have entered into an EU-Israeli association agreement. And within that agreement, Article 2 of that agreement quite clearly states, and it's the legal framework through which this agreement has taken place through Israel and the EU. It says that any violations of human rights would result in the suspension of the agreement. And we have had condemnation from the EU and from the UN and other places as well about illegal settlements. For instance, there were 13 of us MEPs went to Palestine in September of this year, and we were denied access to Gaza.
Yeah.
And that was not in any way showing some degree of goodwill from the Israelis. But when we were in Palestine, what we've seen in the West Bank, and it's to probably put in context some of the comments that was made earlier about how Israel isn't really attacking the West Bank in the same manner as what we witnessed every hour, every day on the social media, every minute of every hour of every day. The truth of what was happening in Gaza was being played out in the social media. But when we were there as 13 MEPs, what we seen was the South Africanization of the West Bank, apartheid roads and walls and buses. What we witnessed around settlement activity and evictions.
All right, but again, my question.
So there's a role. There's in the court of public opinion. And public opinion.
But deals aren't brokered in the court of public opinion. How could Europe be an honest broker, and how can Europe speak with a strong authoritative voice on brokering a deal, like you said, a 2-state solution deal?
Yeah, well, I think you have a number of players here in Europe. For instance, you have us as members of the European Parliament, as MEPs. We have a role to play. I have a role to play as the chair of the delegation in Palestine. But that said, we also need an awful lot of people within and more MEPs to come on board and to see it's not just to be condemning or having one side against another. This is about trying to embrace the difficulties that we have. It's not going to be easy in terms of finding a solution, but a political will. And I think you can't dismiss the court of public opinion, because it will be the people, it's the people who elect us, the people who elect us MEPs and expect us to step up to the mark. And therefore, I think that the MEPs who are elected in member states where there were millions on the streets saying that it was not good enough, what we've seen about a violation of rights, that as MEPs we have to do, we are duty bound to do.
So you're saying the European Parliament can play a major role in this. We have lots of reactions coming in, including one on Facebook from Glenn, saying it's a band-aid fix if they let Hamas continue to control Gaza. I want to ask you about that, Majid Mizawi, that Hamas, who's got in its charter the destruction of the state of Israel, they're part of the problem as well.
Well, I don't know if you missed it, but they signed a declaration saying that they would recognize Israel. It was few time after what we call a war, but it was not a war. A war is between two states, between two armies, and you had the fourth more powerful army against people. So the main issue, I think, is that if nobody says that Israel should be condemned for what they do, Martin Anderson talked about the commercial agreement with between Israel and the European Union. The second article says that if you don't respect human rights, the agreement should be cancelled. It has never been cancelled. We more and more deal with Israel. The United States would give like $220 billion to Israel. But how many money did they send to Israel, like weapons, like money that they give every year to Israel? So what they give from one hand, they take it off by the other hand. I think that the solution is political, and if you don't have sanctions about what Israel does in Gaza and in the West Bank, what Mr. Lovat said, that we will have a déjà vu, and we will see it in 2 or 3 years. So we must be really clear about what's happening there.
I want to ask about Gil Mihaly about the timing of this weekend donors conference. Just 2 days before, on Thursday, I believe, the first meeting inside the Gaza Strip of the Palestinian Unity government, with the Prime Minister making the trip via the Beit Hanun crossing. This particular point in time, would you say that the conditions are better to have discussions between Israel and the Palestinians?
The political problem from the Israeli side, for those who are interested in finding a solution to the problem, is that the Israeli public opinion, which was largely in favor of a compromise and a two-state solution with the Palestinians, had in the last 15 years 2 very bad experiences. There was a bad experience in Lebanon with the Hezbollah, when the withdrawal from what they call the security band didn't bring... From South Lebanon. Didn't bring the peace and quiet that was expected. And then that the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 that we can maybe describe as a unilateral negotiated withdrawal didn't bring either the fruits that were expected by the Israeli public opinion. And when you talk to public opinion, you have to be very simple. So when Israeli says today that territories against peace doesn't work, you need to address that. And they are not 100% wrong. And I think this is the heart of the issue. Because in the last 35 years, Israelis have shown that they are capable of accepting more than they said they would accept, and they were able to dismantle settlements both in Sinai and in Gaza. And I think this is the capital on which we should build.
But maybe we should say why they dismantled the settlements in Gaza, because it was very expensive for them and they could not afford it anymore. The problem is that when they withdrew from Gaza, they did not negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. They just left. And then there were elections and the Hamas was elected, democratically elected. So Israel cannot choose with who they will discuss. They have to discuss with the Palestinian people that have been elected. So they must discuss with Hamas and they must discuss with Fatah. And the problem is that each time that people from the Palestinian side want to end with the occupation, they always find a way to break all the negotiations and to find something to break this and to enhance violence. The problem, I think, is in the hands of the occupant of the country that is occupying now Palestine for more and more than 40 years. So things should end now.
All right. So the argument over who to broker, argument over who to talk with, and again, as we were saying a few minutes ago, Mahmoud Abbas making those calls more and more to go to the United Nations to basically forego U.S. brokered efforts. Hearing Abbas's call is the new center-left coalition government of Sweden.
The Swedish government will recognize the state of Palestine.
Why?
Because we believe that this is an important step towards a two-state solution. We hope that this will inspire and hopefully give some new energy into the negotiations. And we, of course, know and expect that there will be both applause and criticism, but we will engage in a dialogue and in talks with our partners and other countries from both camps.
Now, this Monday, Israel's prime minister reiterating his call to reject recognition of a Palestinian state at this time.
I believe that unilateral steps by the Palestinians at the United Nations will not advance peace. I think they'll do the very opposite. They'll bring about a further deterioration in the situation, something none of us want.
Hugh Lovett, do you agree?
Well, I think, it's obviously a Palestinian state is the stated outcome for all of these negotiations. And I think to go back to a previous point that was made, I mean, and if we're looking at what's happening in Sweden and we're looking at what's happening in the UK, obviously they're not related. I mean, the decisions for the Swedish government to announce that and what's happening in Britain are different dynamics. But they're part of an overall phenomenon that we're seeing in Europe.
All right, so what is, hang on, let's talk
public
about
opinion swinging.
Let's talk about the dynamic in Britain this Monday. Parliament discussing a non-binding resolution to recognize a Palestinian state. How did we get to that point in the UK?
So I think there's a few factors. Obviously, we have seen, and not just the UK, but in Europe generally, there's this swing of public opinion towards a position more sympathetic towards Palestinians. I think we should just say, it's not a majority of Europeans. Majority of Europeans don't have a position either way, but those that do are more inclined to be pro-Palestinian. And consistently, over years, the issue of Palestinian rights, the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is the one that attracts the most attention amongst European publics. In the UK, for example, it's quite regular that the number of letters written by constituents to their MPs, the vast majority of those dealing with foreign policy issues deal with the Palestinian issue. So, it's been underlying for quite a bit. And then obviously we saw the recent war in Gaza. We saw some truly huge demonstrations in London protesting against what is happening. We've seen also a surge in grassroots
all this mobilizing public opinion. Gil Mihaly, you heard what the Israeli Prime Minister had to say, that these kinds of recognitions of a Palestinian state will only entrench Israel's position. Is that a bargaining position?
I don't know. I really don't know. I don't really understand his strategy, actually. And what I wanted to say, considering the European issue, is that after 40 years or 35 years of immigration, what we should understand is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a foreign affairs issue. It becomes an internal affair issue. It's an issue between communities, between ethnics, between religions. And I think that in the future, this is the way that governments will treat this political problem, as an internal issue, and not as a foreign affairs problem.
All right, as a domestic issue, that's an argument that resonates, of course, here in France, home to Europe's largest Jewish and Muslim communities.
But there are also tensions in Sweden, and this is a left-wing government, and there were pressure on the British government during the operation this summer. There was a minister, undersecretary, that resigned.
All right, so Majid, you disagree. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But
no problem. I think it's not an ethnic issue or a community issue. I think it's an issue that must be dealt with all the people of the country.
Majid Mezaouddin, I want to thank you. I want to thank Gil Mehaly. I also want to thank for joining us from London today, Hugh Lovett, Martina Anderson in Brussels. Stay with us. The Media Watch segment of the show is next. Enter Olivia Salazar-Winspear. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Now, we're staying with Gaza in Media Watch this evening. I've been following the issue from a UK perspective, of course, surrounding this non-binding vote. One person who's been cropping up and in the headlines, very outspoken over this, is Baroness Warsi, who is the cabinet minister who you mentioned, who did step down during the summer. She resigned from the government over what she called a morally indefensible stance from the UK. Now, she might not be part of the cabinet anymore, but she is extremely high profile in the media and in politics in the UK. Her Twitter account has been full of campaigning in the run-up to this vote. She's been obviously pushing for the recognition of Gaza, and just to show how much screen time she generally gets, when she announced her resignation in August, she got 17,000 favourites on Twitter within a couple of hours. So this is someone who, when she speaks, people in the UK listen. The day before the vote, she gave an exclusive interview to The Observer, that's the Sunday edition of The Guardian, where she goes through her decision for the first time, talking about this tipping point of seeing photographs of dead children on the beach in Gaza, and saying that the lack of condemnation from David Cameron was something that she couldn't stay with. It's an interesting article because she also goes on to discuss the diplomatic dialogue between the UK and Israel. She's quite critical. She says that the UK's missed its window of negotiation, and she's not the only one in the party who feels like that. And also, she's not the only one in the UK who feels like that, that David Cameron's risking alienating an awful lot of British Muslims, and basically, now that they've lost her as an ally politically, this could be very bad for him in Westminster.
All right, that harks back to what we were saying about how it can become a domestic issue in some instances.
Absolutely, in the UK. Now, going back to more social media, shall we say, or technology-based stories, I've been following this story breaking over the weekend of Snapchat. Now, they had a huge leak over the weekend. This is Snapchat, of course, the messaging site that's visual messaging. You can send a photo to somebody through your phone and it disappears instantly as if by magic. Well, hackers managed to access millions of these photos of their users. So they haven't disappeared. They are very much there now in the public domain. And the concern is that some of these photos were of an explicit nature, perhaps nude or even pornographic images, could even involve minors. As the BBC were reporting, they were saying, you know, this could be extremely dangerous. Snapchat had to react. They put out a statement saying that, well, it wasn't us, the breach of security. This was because people were saving their photos on third-party platforms, and that's how they got hacked. It wasn't Snapchat that was hacked. Now, the tech analysts from Wired say that might be the case, but that's not much of an apology for these people who've had their data put online. And the platform is fatally flawed. This has happened before. It will happen again. So maybe...
You were saying that Snapchat may even be in trouble now.
It could well be in trouble because it's not a problem they're going to be able to resolve in the near future. So this is an application that could have been bought by Facebook at one point last year for $3 billion. That offer was turned down. Let's see if people are still going to be so eager to snap up Snapchat.
Several cautionary tales in what you tell us. Olivia Salazar-Winspear, I want to thank you. I once again want to thank our panel. Thank you for joining us here for the France 24 debate.